Welcome to Global Risk Profile, where we break down global events with context, clarity, and consequence. This show is about the patterns beneath the headlines, about what's really happening, what it means, and why it matters to our future. Today's episode tackles a question that keeps coming up. Why are political developments in Europe so often treated as shocking, even when the signs were there all along? From election results to grassroots protests, conservative wins to centrist failures, each time it happens, the reaction is the same. No one saw it coming. But the truth is, millions of Europeans did see it coming. Let's unpack that. Let's take a step back. Over the past few years, here is what we've been told to expect from Europe. A stable, liberal, progressive, united continent, mostly governed by centrist coalitions, sometimes left-wing, sometimes right-wing, working together on climate, equity, human rights, basically Europe as a grown-up version of what the coastal US imagines itself to be. And yet, the UK leaves the European Union. Giorgia Meloni becomes Prime Minister of Italy. Germany's AfD starts polling second place nationally. Farmers block roads with tractors in the Netherlands and Belgium. France's political center collapses entirely, and Marine Le Pen's party surges to the top. Each time the reaction from many analysts and reporters, especially in the Anglosphere, is the same. Wait, what just happened? Part of the problem is the filter. Most looking to be informed by consuming information from European news outlets in English are getting it from a very specific pool of sources. For example, France 24, a state-funded French broadcasters. Deutsche Welle, Germany's international media arm. Politico Europe, reporting from the corridors of Brussels. English versions of Le Monde, El País, Der Spiegel, all center-left or progressive. These outlets are professional. They're credible. They cover important stories. But they also reflect a very narrow slice of European society. Urban, university-educated, secular, globally minded, mostly liberal on social issues, mostly in favor of EU integration, mostly disconnected from the people who live outside capital cities or who have a more conservative worldview. That doesn't necessarily make them dishonest, but it does mean that entire categories of political reality may go underreported. When Giorgia Meloni's party won the Italian elections in 2022, many headlines simply called her neo-fascist. Yes, her party has post-fascist roots, and yes, she once praised Mussolini as a teenager. But by 2022, Meloni wasn't running on ideology. She was running on disillusionment, with years of unelected technocratic governments, with Brussels-imposed fiscal constraints, and with growing fears around immigration and social fragmentation. She formed a center-right coalition and ran on a platform of lower taxes, stronger borders, and national pride. Millions of Italians voted not out of extremism, but out of frustration. But if you relied only on English language coverage, you'd think Italy had fallen into darkness overnight. I don't think many people now think that, given her government's record over the past 3 years. For years, the AfD was treated as a fringe party, but that's no longer true. Germany's former ruling coalition, Social Democrats, Greens, and Free Democrats, has struggled badly until it fell. Energy prices soared after the rushed shutdown of nuclear power and dependence on Russian gas. Immigration continues to strain social cohesion in parts of the country, and many voters feel cultural values are shifting faster than they can speak about them. The AfD has capitalized on this. In recent state elections, it has hit 20% or higher. It won a mayoral race, and it's rising even in the West, not just in the East. But to much of the English-speaking world, it's always presented as a dangerous anomaly, not a symptom of a deeper fracture. When the Dutch government proposed nitrogen reduction plans that included forcibly buying out farmers to the streets, it wasn't symbolic, it was existential. These were generational family farms, people's entire livelihoods, and the policy came down as a top-down environmental edict without consultation or local buy-in. What happened next? The Farmer Citizen Movement, BBB, was formed, and within a year, it became the largest party in the Dutch Senate. That's not fridge, that's democratic revolt. But if you read only the international coverage, it sounded like a sideshow. In France, President Macron dissolved the National Assembly in 2024 after his party was crushed in European elections. Who rose? Marine Le Pen's national rally. And again, English language headlines warned of far-right surges, but missed the deeper reality. Le Pen's movement is drawing voters from the working class, from disaffected youth, from former leftist unions. Her rhetoric has been softened, rebranded, and, like it or not, normalized by a frustrated electorate. The traditional certain center-left and center-right parties are collapsing. This isn't just about ideology, it's about a vacuum. And nature abhors the vacuum. So why does this keep happening? Why are the same analysts, journalists, and institutions caught off guard over and over? It's not necessarily because they are lazy or stupid. It may be because the way European information is produced, translated, and distributed isn't built for full spectrum understanding. Public broadcasters dominate English language output. Conservative media rarely translate themselves. International reporters often come from elite progressive academic backgrounds, and until recently, language barriers made access to primary sources difficult. The picture we get is filtered, not fake, but curated. And the curation hides the storm gathering just off screen. But it's not just European media shaping the blind spot. Anglo-American institutions have their own vulnerability, one that's gotten worse over time. Let's zoom out for a moment and talk about English-speaking media itself. Not the European outlets publishing in English, but the major players from the US, UK, Canada, and Australia. Think the New York Times, BBC, CNN, The Guardian, ABC, CBC, NPR, Sky, and so on. Decades ago, these institutions had full-time foreign bureaus, journalists based in Rome, Berlin, Warsaw, Budapest, Stockholm, and beyond. They didn't just fly in for the headlines. They lived there, built relationships, learned the rhythms of local life. But in recent years, many of those bureaus have been shuttered or hollowed out. Some closed completely, others kept the name but cut the staff down to one stringer or some rotating freelancers. Budget priorities shifted to digital analytics, video production, or domestic political coverage. And here's the key point. The result isn't that these outlets became less ideological. It's that they became less informed, because they weren't there to watch the story unfold. Let's be clear, I'm not saying that if CBS or The Times had a full-time correspondent in the Netherlands, they would have praised the farmer protests or endorsed the BBB party. What I'm saying is this: they would have seen it coming. They'd have known what the nitrogen rules actually meant to rural communities. They'd have heard the anxieties before they turned into blockades. They'd have interviewed the people voting for the new party before it won a Senate majority. Instead, what happened? News desks in New York or London saw a sudden protest, the tractors on the highway, and had to catch up. They framed it with the tools they had: climate backlash, rural populism, possible far-right links, but without the context, the chronology, the nuance of why and how it built up. They were left reacting to a moment rather than reporting on a movement. And even when there are still foreign correspondents in a place, there is another danger. Proximity is not objectivity. Just look at the case of Walter Duranty, the New York Times reporter in Moscow during Stalin's reign. Duranty lived in the USSR. He was credentialed, he had access, and yet he downplayed or denied Stalin's atrocities, including the Holodomor famine in Ukraine. He won a Pulitzer while hiding genocide. So yes, being present on the ground isn't a magic fix. Reporters can have biases. They can get co-opted. They can fall in love with the narrative power offers. But take away that presence entirely, and what are you left with? You're left with news coverage assembled from wire services, embassy briefings, English language summaries of local media, NGO press releases, tweets, or second-hand articles quoting each other in an echo chamber. It's not necessarily lying. It's distance. And every layer of distance adds distortion. So when editors in New York or Sydney publish stories on the rise of the far right in Europe, they're often working off impressions filtered through layers of translation, assumption, and abstraction. And if you're a policymaker, investor, strategist, or just someone trying to understand the world, you are now 2 or 3 degrees removed from reality, even if you're reading the best coverage available. That doesn't mean these journalists are bad people. It just means their view is limited by design. And in a world where shifts in Europe can affect markets, alliances, migration, energy, and more, that kind of a blind spot isn't academic. It's a strategic risk. To understand why certain political movements in Europe are so often ignored, misread, or aggressively labeled, we need to go back, not just to recent elections, but to the post-war founding logic of modern Europe. After World War II, Europe wasn't just rebuilding its cities, it was rebuilding its soul. What emerged from the ashes was a political and cultural consensus built around a single, deeply understandable fear. Never again fascism, never again nationalism, never again neighbor turning against neighbor in the name of blood, race, or tribe. So, the institutions of post-war Europe, its laws, media, education systems, and later the European Union itself, were built with a kind of firewall logic. For example, Germany's Basic Law banned the resurrection of nationalist parties and created legal guardrails against any movement that could echo the Third Reich. France enshrined laïcité, or hard secularism, not just as a legal principle, but as a national identity, partly to inoculate against religious extremism and authoritarian populism. Italy banned the reconstitution of fascist organizations and marginalized political symbols of the Mussolini era. And when the EU began to emerge, it was more than an economic bloc. It was a moral project, an engine of integration, convergence, and transnational governance designed to dissolve the kinds of national rivalries that had once plunged the continent into war. This logic made sense. It worked to a degree. But here is the catch. Institutions that are built to prevent yesterday's catastrophe often overcorrect so thoroughly that they develop new blind spots. Over time, many European elites began to treat any expression of nationalism, cultural pride, or social conservatism not as a political position, but as a red flag, a warning sign, a slippery slope. The effect? Even moderate democratic expressions of right-of-center identity were viewed with suspicion. National flags, religious appeals, or talk of tradition were treated sometimes literally as precursor to extremism. Political dissent from EU norms on immigration, gender, sovereignty, or green policy was reframed as backsliding, far-right, or anti-democratic. But here is the paradox. Repressing expression doesn't remove resentment. It buries it below radar. And we've seen this pattern before. In our episode on the UK grooming gang scandals, we explored how British institutions, police, councils, child services, overreacted to a real historical trauma, the fear of appearing racist or xenophobic after decades of colonial guilt. In trying to avoid another kind of societal breakdown, they ignored years of abuse, fearing that acknowledging it would fuel racial tensions. But their silence allowed the abuse to continue unchecked. And when the truth finally broke through, it didn't just hurt the victims, it damaged the very institutions that had tried to act nobly. A political version of that may be playing out in parts of Europe today. By suppressing or stigmatizing nationalist and conservative voices, by failing to distinguish between democratic dissent and actual extremism, many European governments and media outlets have created a vacuum of legitimate representation. And when that vacuum gets filled, not by debate, but by anger, populism, or fringe actors, those same institutions express shock, confusion, and fear. But it's not surprising. This is what happens when firewalls are left in place for too long. They don't just block the bad ideas, they start blocking feedback. And without feedback, systems stop adjusting until they break. So no, this isn't a call to remove all constraints. Europe's post-war caution wasn't just valid, it was essential. But like all defensive structures, it needs updates. Because when yesterday's emergency becomes today's dogma, you don't prevent danger. You blind yourself to new forms of it. Misreading Europe isn't just a media problem. It has strategic costs. Foreign governments impose policies with no local legitimacy. Investors misread political risk and regulatory backlash. Institutions push reforms that spark protest instead of support. And trust in journalism erodes, fueling further polarization. Every shock result is a sign not just of political change, but of analytical failure. Let's pause and talk directly, especially to those of you who aren't watching Europe just out of curiosity. Maybe you're in public policy. Maybe you're a business leader assessing market risk. Maybe you're an analyst, investor, or just someone trying to stay ahead of the curve. Whatever the case, you've probably sensed something odd about how European politics is covered in English. When progressive parties or causes gain ground, we hear about it quickly and clearly. Their leaders speak fluent English, their think tanks publish internationally, and their causes show up in The Guardian, Foreign Affairs, Politico, and global summits. But when populist, nationalist, or conservative movements surge, sometimes winning elections outright, what do we get? Not their own words, not their arguments, but someone else's summary of them, often hostile, often oversimplified. Why? The truth is, most conservative movements in Europe don't speak in English. Not publicly, not directly, and not often. They see a little upside to that. English-speaking institutions are seen as suspicious or hostile. Coverage is often critical regardless of substance. So many of these groups make a different choice. Stay local, stay untranslated, speak only to the base. And maybe that makes sense for them, but it doesn't work for you. If you're trying to assess what's really happening in Europe, then you're working with a partial picture. You're flying blind and you don't know it. That vacuum doesn't stay empty. It gets filled by distortions, propaganda, or silence mistaken for consensus. And if you keep being surprised, that's why. And here is something else worth saying, especially if you lean progressive. This isn't about helping your opponents. It's about seeing clearly. Because even if you oppose these parties, wouldn't you rather really understand what they're doing, what's resonating, where they're rising, and why? You can't strategize effectively with a distorted map. Knowing the full picture doesn't just empower conservatives, it sharpens everyone's game. So what do? We stop waiting for the truth to arrive in a press release, and we start building our own mosaic. That means reading across the spectrum, using AI to translate non-English outlets, watching polling trends, not just headlines, listening to the quiet parts of the continent, not just the capitals. In short, we think like historians. We triangulate meaning from competing sources, and we understand that clarity doesn't come from a single voice, but from comparison, reflection, and time. You've been watching Global Risk Profile. If you found today's episode valuable, please subscribe and share it with someone who keeps getting surprised by European politics. And remember, the headlines are where narratives are spun, but the truth lives in footnotes, in quiet protests, in translated transcripts, in place no one bothers to look. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and as always, stay sharp.